Okay, um, we know via science that our perceptions are by no means objective and fundamental because each species' perceptions differs from one another. How a dog perceives, and how a cat perceives, and how an amphibian perceives, and how an octopus perceives, and how birds perceive, and how humans perceive the world are all radically different from one another. And therefore, if you claim perception is objective and fundamental, the question arises which one has the correct perception? And the correct response to that is none of them do. All their perceptions differ because all their brains are configured differently. Yes, there is a fundamental aspect to the world in the form of quantum energy. The quantum energy is fundamental, but how that quantum energy collapses into our perception is entirely subjective, and that is what the overwhelming majority of experts in this field of visual perception say. Um, Everybody, or not everybody, but well, the overwhelming majority in this field of visual perception are in agreement that our reality is not an actual reality. The best that can be said about it is that it is a virtual reality. It's an appearance. Our perception is not fundamental. Um, Even Analisath, he is like a hardcore materialist. Like he is stuck in like the Victorian era mindset where everything is just matter, and yet even he says that quote unquote reality is just an illusion generated by our brain. To take this point a bit further, if you take some substance that alters the configurations of your brain, your perception that you take to be so fundamental and objective suddenly collapses into a bowl of soup, into an amorphous bowl of soup. So what happened? I thought your perception was like totally objective and fundamental, and obviously it's not. In fact, there are these illusions you can see on YouTube that actually change your visual perception. Like like the hypnotic stuff, where it's like a disc, and you like look in the center of it, and it's like turning around, and then you look away from it, and your perception is all like morphing, and it just like dissolves into a bowl of soup basically because it temporarily changes the configurations of your brain. So your perceptions are not fundamental. The best that can be said about your perception is that it's virtual. It's a virtual reality, not a substantive reality. Um, why doesn't the Bible talk about this? Eastern mystics talk about this. They call the word Maya, which means illusion, or a better translation would be something like virtual reality. You don't find that anywhere among Christian theologians or in the Bible, and that is proof that Hinduism has a more advanced spiritual consciousness than Christianity, because they actually talk about that stuff, about the world being virtual and an illusion. Christianity doesn't. To take this point even further, just as in a virtual reality headset, you have pixels, and as you zoom out from the pixels then start to appear as virtual objects, like virtual chairs, virtual character, virtual body, and you can't take those virtual objects and remove them from the pixels because there's nothing to them except the pixels. They are just the pixels appearing in that way. In the same way, when you have atoms and you zoom out from the atoms and you keep zooming out, eventually the atoms start appearing as perceptible objects, like tables, apples, chairs, computers. And you cannot take those perceptible objects and remove them from the atoms, because there's nothing to them but the atoms. So how virtual reality functions and how our perception culminates works the same way. Our perceptions are appearances of atoms, just as in a virtual reality headset, The player's perceptions are appearances of pixels, for the reasons former mentioned. You can't remove our perceptions from atoms because there's nothing to them but atoms. They're just appearing in a certain way when you zoom out from them. Just as the player can't remove the virtual objects he perceives from pixels because there's nothing to them but pixels. And how those pixels are appearing to the player depends totally upon the configuration of his virtual reality headset. Hence, not all players will see the virtual reality world in the same way. It will vary from player to player depending upon the configuration of their VR headset. In the same way, how we perceive the perceptible domain, how those atoms appear when you zoom out from them, depends upon the configuration of our brain. Hence why visual perception differs from person to person and from species to species. And therefore, the inference is that we live in a virtual reality. How visual perception works and how virtual reality works are identical. I mean, even that collapse of the quantum energy doesn't occur until there is perception. Just as in a virtual reality headset, the virtual reality world doesn't get rendered until it's perceived by the player, by the VR headset. So our perception doesn't get rendered, literally, until it's perceived. How virtual reality works and how human perception works, it's identical. And lo and behold, we've actually created video games recently that the graphics look identical to human visual perception. And that says a lot about, and you can put on a VR headset and you would not realize that you are in a virtual reality after a while. You would think that you are in everyday human experience, and that says a lot about the nature of existence. So why doesn't Abrahamic religion, Islam and Christianity talk about this, whereas Hinduism does? They're pretty open about it. They say the world is Maya, it's an illusion. You can't find any Christian theologian saying that, and this shows that Hindus have a far more advanced spiritual consciousness than Christians and Muslims do. And the fact that Muslims and Christians and Jews never even got that far, they never even got as far to call, our perception virtue, or at the very least illusory, shows that these are not religions that you can trust to give you enlightenment, to teach you the actual nature of existence. Because if they didn't even notify you of that, how on earth can you trust them to give you accurate information regarding, what happens after death, or who you actually are, or what the soul is, or quote-unquote soul? How can you trust them with any of this information if they didn't even get as far to declare human perception, the perceptible world, as virtual or illusory? You can't trust them. So take it into consideration.